Demetria Martinez came of age in the 1980s during the troubled times of revolution, death squads, desaparecidos, and diaspora in Central America. Her social conscience joined with those of other committed Americans who worked to offer refuge to exiled victims of the civil wars in Central America. In defiance of the Reagan administration's refusal to admit these refugees to the United States, ordinary citizens of conscience formed the sanctuary movement to offer humanitarian aid and refuge to these beleaguered people. In 1987, 11 months after she covered a story on the sanctuary movement for the Albuquerque Journal, a retaliatory federal indictment was brought against Demetria Martinez, alleging that she had induced and transported 2 Salvadorian refugee women illegally into the United States while covering the story of their receiving sanctuary here. For doing her work as a journalist and following her conscience about the humanitarian rights of asylum of political refugees, she now faced a lengthy trial, legal expenses, and a possible 25 years in prison, and a $750,000 fine. Demetria Martinez will tell you today about the inseparable connection in her life and writing between social justice, spirituality, and art. A Protestant minister active in the sanctuary movement told her in 1986 about 2 pregnant women, refugees from the war-ravaged El Salvador, whom he was helping to bring safely into the United States before they gave birth in December. He invited Martinez to accompany him to meet the women in Juarez, across the border from El Paso, as background for her writing the story on the refugees. Here was a contemporary version of the biblical narrative the biblical nativity narrative, Martinez thought, Mary's seeking refuge to deliver the Christ child and the Holy Family fleeing oppression. Her planned article for a Christmas feature in the Albuquerque Journal would be a creative re-elaboration of liberation theology, which had inspired many of the oppressed in El Salvador and the sanctuary workers in the U.S. The Reagan administration thought otherwise and indicted Martinez as a test case to intimidate journalists and the sanctuary movement workers who publicly confronted the U.S. funding of the Salvadorian armed forces with over $1 million a day. Fortunately, the Big Brother tactic was unsuccessful, and the jury in Albuquerque acquitted Martinez, upholding the First Amendment. Demetria Martinez is a writer of courage and conviction, a public intellectual, journalist, talented poet and novelist. Recruited by several Ivy League universities from her public high school in Albuquerque, she chose Princeton, where she earned a BA as a Wilson Scholar, after which she returned to Albuquerque to study sacred art for 3 years at Sagrada Art School. She covered religion for the Albuquerque Journal, and in 1990 moved to Kansas City to become a staff writer and national news editor of the National Catholic Reporter. In 1993, she moved to Tucson, where she continued to write on Latino issues for the National Catholic Reporter and other publications, and was active with the Arizona Border Rights Project. Most recently, she returned to Albuquerque to live. She has published 3 powerful collections of poetry: Turning, 1989, Breathing Between the Lines, 1997, The Devil's Workshop, 2002, and the innovative and widely read novel Mother Tongue, 1994. An active, progressive Latina Catholic, Martinez views writing as an act of spirituality grounded in her commitment to social and political justice. She will share with us today her insights on the interconnection of creative writing, journalism, Catholic social practice, and the plight of immigrants from Mexico and Latin America, based on her work with Catholic faith communities along the Arizona-Mexico border. Her talk and reading are entitled Religion, Gender, and Ethnic Identity in Fiction and Poetry. Please welcome Demetria Martinez, one of the foremost Latina writers in the U.S. today.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here today. I'm so happy to see all of you and to be on this familiar campus. It was such a joy to be here 2 years ago, and so I have very good memories. The wonderful thing about a title, Religion, Gender, and Ethnic Identity in Fiction and Poetry, is that I can say anything. I can stand on my head and it'll be related. So what I'd like to do today is to give you a little sampling of my writing. I'm going to open with a very brief essay that I wrote for Sojourners magazine I believe it was about 10 years ago. I was asked to write about the relationship between spirituality and being a writer. I focus specifically on being a novelist, but I know it applies to being a poet. It's entitled Spirit Matters. Writers are contemplatives. Daily we give ourselves over to silence, only to find the world at its worst, marching across the snowy horizon of the page. The characters one had such hope for turn out to be, well, human. They hate, manipulate, seduce other people's spouses. They love money, worry about their looks, and fume about the state of the nation while making no effort to change things. This is not to say that grace does not happen in their lives, instances of beauty and truth, wee epiphanies that unleash desire to live for something more, something the world's religions have named variously as compassion, agape, wakefulness, tikkun, the call to repair the earth. But all it takes is a traffic jam, a bad hair day, and my characters, those mirrors of my own heart, forget, entering once again into what Buddhism calls Maya, illusion, or what Christians call sin. Still, the novelist hopes. We watch our characters without judgment, embracing equally what is lovely and sinister. We hope that in the end they will learn something about life and love. That is, if the darkness they court does not swallow them up first. At times we try to push our creations toward safety and right action. But souls, even fictional ones, are not so easily manipulated. Like a parent, the novelist must eventually get out of the way so that characters can become their own persons and to enter into their own pacts with God and the devil. Chapter by chapter, our characters teach us that few people are wholly good or wholly evil. The writer who cannot love the color gray, who cannot embrace a world that is less than black and white, will not last long. Our creations will die for lack of compassion if we replace truth-telling with moralizing. I'm not sure what any of this has to do with God or spirituality. Those words bandied about so readily frighten me, even as they draw me like a moth to flame. I'm always amazed by the number of artists I know who once dreamed of becoming priests or nuns, myself included. It seems, however, that in reaching for heaven, we fell all the harder back to earth. The novelist is condemned to earth. We are called to be faithful not to abstract doctrine, so vaunted by organized religion, but to what our five senses tell us about the world around us. We may be affiliated with religions that preach a loving, all-powerful, and just God, but we are not God's public relations flax. In our writing, we must be willing to indict God, to tell the other side of the story. We tell stories as we find them, of the war veteran, the refugee, the ill, the lonely, the insane. The novelist begs the question, where were you, O God? We leave it to theologians to formulate answers. Our work is to stand in solidarity with those who have no answers. And when our characters experience what seems to be the presence of the sacred in a moment of healing, heroism, cleansing anger, or bliss, we tell that story too. For who is not to say that the world as a whole is not struggling to realize a greater experience of the sacred? The writer's imagination must be roomy and supple enough for hope and joy, as well as gloom and doom. Our imaginations must be on call at all times, open to any possibility. So we fight sloth and fear and struggle to show up each day before the blank page. If a writer can be said to have a spiritual practice, this is it: to stay awake until the imagination stirs and music comes out of our hands. My hope is that by writing well, I will keep you, the reader, awake and in love with the human project, despite the dark times in which we live. This morning I had one of those magnificent moments of showing up to the page sleepily and then having a poem come to me, which I wrote out, and I'd like to share that with you today. It's called Santa Barbara. You see them everywhere if you choose to: brooms, rags, rakes. The people who hold these things are renewing your world. Hidden among the pay stubs are the scrolls, the Spanish you forgot or never learned. Hidden among the soap slivers are the ceremonias you forgot or never learned. Tonight, the maid will go home, wash her hands, then make the sign of the cross with an egg over the body of a mute child. You are that child. The maid, your mother, has left the closet light on for you. When you wake up, you will have the words, "At last," to offer her thanks. About a month or so before, 2 months before the war on Iraq, actually the war had been going on for 10 years. We've been bombing Iraq about 3 times a week, but the most recent invasion that began in March, before that happened, I was wanting to forget this pending war and not go to a demonstration, not do anything. And I opened up a cookbook and found, of course, a recipe from Iraq. And this poem is called Just Dessert, Date Halva Recipe from Iraq. Finely chop 2 cups of dates, mix with a half a cup each walnuts and almonds, both chopped. Mix above in a bowl. On a board sprinkled with powdered sugar, roll the mixture with your hands, then slice. Halwa is an Arabic word for sweet. Iraq is one of the world's biggest exporters of dates, or was. Man cannot live by oil alone. I'll read now a few poems from The Devil's Workshop. Everyone asks me, why did you give it that name? Our mothers were right when and our abuelas were right when they said idleness is the devil's workshop. And that phrase means more to you as you hit 40 and you realize with luck you have half a life left and you better get writing. As Chicanas, as Latinos, we're heir to a number of languages, not only Spanish, but languages that were wiped out or repressed for various reasons that we were not able to learn. So you hear a reference in here to Tewa, which is one of the Pueblo languages in New Mexico, that you hear in New Mexico. Ladino, which is what we spoke 500 years ago in Spain, before we were, as Jews, before we were kicked out. And Nahuatl, the language which is still very much alive of the Aztec people. This is called Song. I dreamed my voice was an Anasazi pot filled with Tewa, Ladino, and Nahuatl. The conquistadores crushed it when they heard its savage sounds. My songs and prayers bled into the ground. And when the West was won and paved, the topsoil with all my words blew away. 7 shards of pottery were all I could find. I strung them together, a wind chime. I am mute, but the breeze is strong. O sad, triumphant, beautiful song, my sad, triumphant, beautiful song. This poem I called my midlife crisis poem, but mind you, I've been having a midlife crisis since I was 8 years old. I think it's part of being a poet, so it doesn't bother me anymore. So much of my poetry, I realize after I've written it, is just saturated with religious imagery, references to the stories that Jesus told, the stories in the Hebrew scriptures. It's just part, I guess, of growing up Latina and Catholic. It's there always. This poem is called Threads. At this age, you start to wonder which proverbs apply. You paint one wall only, Bordello burgundy. You welcome into your life a man who brings flowers and flyers, calls to boycott a clothing store with sweatshops in Vietnam. At this age, you touch what little sanctity you can muster. The yearning burns to do more by hand, to thread your very life through a needle's eye. This is for Sonia, who was born on May 26, 2000, and who died the same day. I refer to her parents here. He's Jewish and a brilliant writer, and she's a sculptor, so you hear the reference to the clay and the ink. I felt it was important in the midst of all the grief to celebrate the fact that she had come. She'd kept her promise. La promesa. You floated with the majesty of a storm into life and into death. We made a home for you, but you carried off the roof. We cupped our hands, but your sweet waters turned to ash. You wreaked so much hope and havoc, hacking away at our dead roots. We're wanderers again in clay and in ink, remaking our covenant to become the eye of the storm, el ojo de Dios. There is no promised land, but the promise is good. You said you would come, and you did. Huracán, rainbow, palo verde twig in the beak of a hummingbird. One thing that also makes many appearances in my work are remedios. We all grew up, whatever our culture, with references to so-called folk remedies, which turn out to be actually based in very sophisticated medical systems of healing, which we had very powerfully as Aztecs, which we had with the Native Americans, which we had when the Spaniards came and brought their Moorish and Greek theories and understandings about how healing happens. Anyway, so it's an obsession of mine. I always sometimes want to throw my hands up and say, I don't want to be a writer anymore. I want to go off and give people hierbas. So that I always have that out. This poem is called Insomnia. You should be sleeping the sleep of the dead. You set out melatonin tablets like landmines, but your monkey mind leaps over each one. You try acupuncture, meditation, confession. You sprinkle the bed with miracle dust from Chimayo, Chicana feng shui, the TV sheeted in purple like Lent. It occurs to you to read the complete book of needlework. 10 pages, and your eyes close like hibiscus blossoms until the needle of wakefulness pricks your dreams. The noises in your head are shrimp scuttling along the ocean floor, filth eaters, radiant with half-life, Already your day is dying like a coral reef. So much of my sense of history is shaped by the Vietnam War, even though I was just a little girl. I think it gave me a sense of a kind of a pending apocalypse. So oddly enough, when 9/11 happened, it was almost like, it was horrific, but it was almost like I'd always been waiting my whole life for the other shoe to drop. I remember watching TV at night, and in those days they didn't couch terms like deaths, civilian deaths or deaths of our troops by calling it collateral damage or anything like that. They just, they called it deaths. And I can remember watching Walter Cronkite at night, every night giving what they called the body count. And then you had things that were called body bags. Today they call them human remains pouches. And seeing the body bags, and when I was a child, I told myself two things. I told myself that my father was too old to be called up to go off to war. And yet I must have told myself something else, because every time that the mail would come, and if my parents weren't looking, I would look for a letter that had a return address from Washington, D.C. And I would hold it up, I'd put it up against the window and see if I could see Lyndon Johnson's signature or Nixon's signature, to see if it was a letter written to my father that would call him off to war. My father was in the Marine Corps Reserves at the time. And so obviously I lived within two myths. He's too old, and actually the myth which was the truth, which is that he could have been called up at any moment. It was only recently that I asked my father, what was the truth of that? And he said, he said, I had a sea bag ready, he said. I had a pair of everything in there, shoes, pants, etc. We had to be ready to go in a moment. We had to have all our papers in order. So that sense of apocalypse, that everything, the world as I knew it, could be torn apart, was very much a part of my growing up. This very short poem is something that I think in many ways took me a lifetime to write about it. It's called Birthday. I was born in the year of the rat, black lung from the incense of burning American flags. First poems penned by the rocket's red glare. Math was simpler. 58,000 soldiers, and then there were none. I was born in the year of the rat, 38 years, a life still at half staff. Let me find you one more poem. Do you want funny or serious, or what do you want? Funny. All right, let's go for funny. Oh, well, heck, then I could do all the relationship poems. I would have you guys laughing or weeping. I'm not sure which. This is a favorite poem of mine along the lines I discussed earlier of Remedios, and in fact it's called Remedios. Each cough is an underground nuclear explosion, unraveling your body's hard-won peace accord. It's back to the bargaining table. Garlic, sea, zinc, OSHA root, a 5-day course of antibiotics, and a glow-in-the-dark vaporizer, UFO among the mists. You quiet your mind, that well-stocked pond of opinion. You meditate on your lungs, failed sails. Herbs from Uruguay float in a teapot like lashes. The package reassures. You are saving the rainforest with each new bout of respiratory illness. Your body starts a fever, a controlled burn. You fear you will go up like Los Alamos, but your brain is an underground lab, oblivious to the flames, busy with equations. You are too sick to be in one place at one time, much less 10 places at one time. So when friends call, you say no. No, 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 no. Then you just let it ring. Already you are shaking this thing. Like the Mayas, you discover the zero, the Buddha you, the wind blows through. This poem I wrote for my parents, and then we'll move on to mother tongue. It's called Final Exams. Now it's our parents handing us report cards. Mom and Dad passed their first biopsies with extra credit for lower cholesterol. Mom calls Tucson, triumphant, tells her 40-year-old, "You kids are stuck with me." Dad calls, solemn, the good Marine, grateful that the children can't court-martial him for bowls of menudo at Varela's restaurant. Still, the rules hold. Exercise, greens, and no red meat. So when Death dries her dishwater hands on her apron and steps out on the porch to call my parents in, they can look down from their tree house and yell, "Not time yet, not time." Okay, I'm going to read a few passages from Mother Tongue and attempt in doing that to express what I think are some of the central ideas, the ideas that hold the novel up. Now remember, I wrote this novel, and you can ask me questions about this today and tomorrow. I wrote it in a trance. It began by the hearing of a voice when I was at a conference where Sandra Cisneros was reading. As Sandra was reading, I heard the voice, the opening line of the novel. His nation chewed him up and spat him out like piñón shell. And when he emerged from an airplane one late afternoon, I knew I would one day make love with him. And I heard that line and I said, oh my God, that's not the opening line of a poem. That's a novel. I don't want to write a novel. I don't know how to write a novel. Demetria, go to your sleep and go to bed, and when you wake up tomorrow, you'll have come to your senses. That's what I told myself. So I went back to my hotel room. It was in Chicago. And I woke up the next morning and I heard that sentence again. It was as if people were shouting it from the streets below. And I felt like a quickening. I've never had children, but I can speak metaphorically. It was like a quickening. It was an epiphany. It was an overflow of just peace and joy. And so I wrote down that sentence. And for the next 9 months, while I was working full-time at National Catholic Reporter, I wrote the novel. I'd come home after work and say a prayer and write. I'd set the oven timer for 50 minutes, and I wrote it in 50 minutes every other day, and then with a longer day, preferably on Saturday or Sunday. And then it was done. And so it was a great mystery, a great gift to me. Ellen described the social context, the political context. This is about a refugee who comes to New Mexico, a refugee from El Salvador who comes to New Mexico and falls in love with Mary, with Maria, a Chicana, who's living in Old Town in Albuquerque. At the time, there was this amazing thing called the Sanctuary Movement, which soon will be written, I believe, into the history books, but there hasn't been time enough yet. People throughout this country and actually throughout the world realized that the United States was acting illegally by not allowing refugees from El Salvador and Guatemala to receive political asylum here. If you were fleeing what was then the Soviet Union, you got, for example, automatic refugee status. That wasn't happening here. Why? Because we were supporting the dictatorships of Guatemala and El Salvador in the name of fighting communism. In fact, what we were doing was assisting death squads and militaries, the military of these right-wing dictatorships, who were basically killing, disappearing, and torturing anybody who tried to question the status quo. What do I mean by status quo? About 14 families in El Salvador owned most of the land. And so the mass of people were kept in poverty. So if some nun came along and said, I think this village needs a literacy center, or if some priest came along and said, I think we need to dig a well, they were accused of being communists because they were questioning the system. And they were doing that, as you'll see from the passage I'll be reading, that they were doing that because of what was then known, and is still known as liberation theology. But all theology should be about liberation. So I don't think it's, sometimes I worry that it becomes a kind of a catchphrase. Anything that is about God should be about liberating people. But anyway, let me read these passages to you. So churches throughout the country began to declare themselves sanctuaries in defiance of the United States government, believing the United States was breaking the law, which in fact turned out to be true. And so they smuggled refugees in and gave them sanctuary in their homes, food, clothing, and then if a refugee decided that they could no longer stand living underground, they would often go through what we call the Underground Railroad up to Canada. They would be smuggled up to Canada, where they had a greater chance, a much greater chance at that time of receiving political asylum. People were very creative about how you smuggled refugees up. And so this is Maria and Jose Luis preparing a car that belongs to Soledad, who's Mary's godmother. The Sandia Mountains, true to their name, this is in Albuquerque, ripened at daybreak, the color of watermelon. Here is a postcard of the Sandias. This is how they looked one early morning when Jose Luis and I were loading up Soledad's brown station wagon. Two friends of hers were borrowing it for a fishing trip. Roped to the top of the car, a canoe extended over the windshield like the beak of an eagle. Fishing rods poked out of windows like antennae. One of Soledad's friends, they did not tell us their names, adhered a Reagan Bush sticker to the car's back bumper. In those days, the Border Patrol did not stop cars with Reagan Bush or Right to Life stickers on them. Nor did the patrol stop and question white men. In my memory, one of Soledad's friends that morning had blonde hair and wore horn-rimmed glasses. Back then, when fishing trip meant transporting refugees north, a white man was an asset. Millions of years of genetic coding culminated in a kind of liturgy. Each time a Border Patrol agent waved him past the checkpoint outside El Paso. Around the time of Jose Luis's arrival, large numbers of U.S. citizens were beginning to make trips to El Salvador in groups called delegations. They met with sisters and priests, unionists, students, those who worked the land, anyone whose life the government had deemed dispensable, that is to say, poor people, most of El Salvador's population. And when delegations returned to the States, members spoke to anyone who would listen, in parish halls, homes, and on campuses. Jose Luis and I were among those who attended these presentations. I got good at whispered translations, rapid-fire summaries. Sometimes, exhausted, I reverted to Spanglish. I sprinkled Spanish words about just so, like dots in a connect-the-dot puzzle. And Jose Luis made the connections, discerning the full shape of the speaker's intent. What I did not need to translate, however, was the grief in the voice of a U.S. citizen who went to El Salvador to learn about la situación and who came away with a memory of evil. Innocence was lost time and again in this fashion, leaving a void that would be filled with either forgetting or anger, and anger embodied very often in commitment. A priest who had traveled with an Albuquerque delegation came back with bullet casings imprinted with the name of a U.S. city, I can't recall which one, where they had been manufactured. A month or so later, the cleric gave away his possessions and returned to El Salvador for good, to work with the poor. These were not isolated incidents, but formed what became a movement of sorts, of U.S. citizens taking an option for the poor, which liberation theologians said was God's way of acting in history. So there was a sense of, when people talked about liberation theology and why they felt that they had to become involved with the sanctuary movement, that this was God acting in history, and this was a chance to be a co-creator with God. This was a chance as well to be a part of this, to help, because God only has our hands to use, to help bring this forth. The novel also deals with images of God, though, at a very personal level. And by God, I include Mary, who makes an appearance, I don't mean it that way, but who appears in the novel toward the end as an icon of the mother of the disappeared, la madre de los desaparecidos. And it's actually based on an icon that a friend of mine made, Robert Lentz, a very internationally known iconographer. He was inspired by the mothers of the disappeared of Chile and the Latin American countries who protest wearing white scarves, waiting for their demanding of the government that their disappeared children be returned or accounted for. And so it's this beautiful icon of Our Lady in a white scarf holding a crown of thorns. And behind her is a chalk mark on a sidewalk. And when bodies were found in El Salvador, the cops, the police, who were, of course, usually many oftentimes behind or complicit with the murders, would mark out where the body had been. And so you get this image of, Our Lady just waiting for all of her children to return. And so she becomes a very important symbol in this book, I would say the central symbol. It's funny because my book is looked at often, from a feminist perspective, from a class perspective, all these perspectives, and they're all equally valid. But I think the one that deals with religion and spirituality is at the heart of it. One of the ways that I believe that God acts in history, if there is a God, I say all this knowing that no one's come down yet with a photograph from heaven, so I think it's important to be humble, but he knows, she knows if he or she exists, and that's all that matters to me. But there's so much arrogance, people running around today killing each other because they know what God thinks. So I like to qualify everything by saying, as long as God knows, we don't have to know. So anyway, but I believe that God acts in history by presenting herself or himself with new faces to us. And so that's what inspired this paragraph, and then I think we'll just let it open to questions. Photograph of my bedroom altar, Old Town. Santo Niña de Atocha, a Christ child on a throne who wears out his shoes as he wanders around each night doing good deeds. Miniature Taos Pueblo incense burner. Painting of Our Lady of Guadalupe from Nogales. African fertility doll, her coal-black head shaped like pita bread. Mouthwash bottle filled with holy water Soledad had a priest bless. A film canister full of healing earth from the sanctuary at Chimayo. I liked it that Jose Luis and I made love in the presence of my santos. I knew they had blessed my love for him, however imperfect it was, however mad. They were not like the white God I'd had to kill. That women like me must kill if we are to have any hope of ever finding God. Nothing replaced him for a very long time. But looking back, I can see that the growing chaos inside blazed away dead growth, clearing a space, however violently, for God to be reborn. Thank you.
Before we open up to questions or comments, and remember that if you have a question or a comment, raise your hand and we'll get one of the microphones to you. But while we do that, I want to introduce to you, we have a very distinguished guest with us, a distinguished scholar from Mexico who is here visiting us, and I'd like to present her to you, Professor Alicia Azuela. Alicia, could you just stand up, please? And she's accompanied by our very, very beloved and eminent senior scholar here in the Department of Chicano Studies, Professor Luis Leal. Professor Leal. So we'll open it up now to questions and your comments for the next maybe 15 minutes, and then we'll have the reception and book signing over here.
Ellen.
Demetria, we studied or read your poem Nativity yesterday in class, and we're seeing the similarities between the image of the car decorated and the eagle of the canoe. So what was the process of those two coming together, one in a novel and one in a poem? Was one written first and then reconfigured, or did you write them both together?
I mean, it's half of the time when you're writing, you don't know what you're doing, until afterwards, so that I have to say that first. But the great thing is when you write enough, you can steal from yourself. And so that had appeared first in a poem, and I'd written that poem after taking this trip to the border with the Lutheran minister when he went to pick up the two Salvadoran women, and those were grafted from reporters' images, reporters' notes. And then when I was writing the novel, and I guess I was, looking for a way to describe this boat, this car, and how it was, had a canoe over it. Well, I just took those images from the poem. And so, I always tell people who want to write enough, and, you just steal from yourself over and over. But all that was taken from reality. And I think it finally came out in court. Again, people had to be very clever about how to disguise vehicles if you were going to smuggle. And so you tried to put, Reagan Bush, right to life, I'd rather be fishing stickers, and, a canoe, rods. And so that was actually the way that one of the vehicles on this trip was disguised. Yes?
Like, in your own words, how would you describe the importance of retelling history in kind of like the inadequate narrative postmodern form? Does that make sense? Oh
my God, you probably could answer that question better than I could. I don't know. All I know is that I was seized by a story, and there were days that it was really hard to write, and so I began to cheat, and I would write a grocery list, and then I would write, and that would be my quota for the day, and then I'd make up a political flyer. Then I would make up Associated Press articles coming in from El Salvador. And then I included a prayer. And that was kind of a critical moment, a prayer that I think Soledad had sent to Maria, or told her some prayer that she told her to pray. I think she sent it to her, it was on paper. I wanted to honor all those little things that we often look at as not important or non-literary, that our mothers send us. I mean, my mother is a clipper and saver, like you wouldn't believe. I mean a prayer. I mean an article on how to avoid stress, political flyers. I mean, we live in the same town, and I still get this, but when I was off at school and so forth, I was inundated with this. And, you can walk into my house. I'm 42 years old, and there's little postums all over the place that say, be sure and buy vinegar and try mixing it with, whatever, and it'll clean the toilet out. It'll get that scum out of the toilet. I mean, and I wanted a way to honor all these little, I guess you all call them texts. I wanted a way to honor these little pieces of paper that come into our lives and make up life, recipes. And I realized that it certainly added to the texture of the story. It became a way of telling the story, of moving the story forward. Also, I was terrified of transition sentences. I didn't know how to write a novel. And I've always disliked transition sentences. And anyway, that's another discussion. So I just used white space, and then, slipped in a recipe, and then moved on to the next thing, And so that's a little, some way of answering your question, but we're seized by stories, and form follows content. If you're seized by that story, it will reveal to you how it wants to be told. And that's always an issue for me, because I often approach my material and say, oh my God, does this want to be a column for NCR? Does this want to be a poem? Does this want to be a short story? Does this want to be, an essay or commentary for this book that I'm working on? And I tear at my hair, and then I just try to quiet down and be with the story. And it will tell me what form it wants to be in. A friend of mine, Anya Achtenberg, we teach a workshop together called Writing for Social Change, Redream a Just World. And she has often said, we're not writing a story, we're telling a story. And so I try to stay as grounded as possible and near to what it is that wants to get out. Yes.
Obviously, in a mother tongue, it's very, you draw very heavily from your own personal experiences and tradition, but are there any specific events from the text that are like directly autobiographical?
Oh, I'm going to take the fifth on that.
Yeah, I know it's like, it's
and
obviously
leave it to your imagination.
It's a very personal novel, but...
You know, yeah, I take the fifth. But I'll tell you, how many of us, and you guys are at that age, you know, didn't waste a lot of our years doing research into romantic love. And oftentimes that's about wanting to be saved or wanting to save somebody. I wish I had spent, if I had spent all that time writing, I would be the author of 12 novels, you know. On the other hand, I was able to redeem a lot of that lost time by turning it into a story that, you know, I hope is useful for people, because we have a lot of myths, I think, about love. It can be intoxicating, but, you know, it can be very... Well, you know, you guys are the experts now. I'm not an expert anymore. Let's see.
I was just wondering, what was the feminist critique on your book? Because it seemed like throughout the novel, Maria, her character seems to be really dependent on Jose Luis and what he wants, and she tends to, her whole identity is wrapped up in him. So I was kind of wondering, what was the feminist critique on it?
Well, I haven't read the papers, but I can tell you this. Women become feminists because they've had that experience. Right? You know, in other words, it's like I said earlier in the paper that I wrote, you know, as much as we want our characters to behave, you know, like they were born feminists, you know, or born enlightened, or born, it don't happen that way. You know, you struggle, and then out of that struggle comes your theology, your philosophy. And so, you know, what I think we see in Maria is an honest evolution of a woman. I mean, she goes from being highly, you know, projecting all this stuff on Jose Luis, and she's the one who's going to save him from, you know, an ordinary life. And then as you go deeper, you see what her real issues are. And she's able to, you know, encounter those and find her own political voice. I mean, it sounds like nothing, but she gets involved in the PTA. And next thing you know, she's fighting to get, you know, materials in the schools that the principals don't want on nuclear waste or some such thing. You know, and now now you can be called a terrorist for that, you know. So she becomes politicized, you know, very much in her own way, and even through the experience of motherhood, which was interesting to me, because I'm not a mother, I'm a crazy aunt to 3 beautiful kids. And so that's how that evolves. But I think that's a really important question. Yes. Oh, I thought you were asking the question.
If no one else will, I'll ask one more.
I was going to ask a question.
Yeah, I told Mario that if it goes silent, yes.
No, I was just curious, in terms of the political refugees from El Salvador and Guatemala that your novel deals with, what has happened to many of these refugees now, several years later? Have some of them returned? Have some of them remained? What has happened, as far as you know, to many of these political refugees? What has happened to their lives?
A number miraculously have returned. They knew that they could go back now and not be shot on sight. Now, of course, we left because of past political work. Unfortunately, we left that country in shambles. I mean, you know, the United States, supporting death squads and right-wing militaries, you know, contributed to the death of 75,000 civilians. And so the country economically is in shambles, and there's been a tremendous rise in just crime. People are hungry and they commit crimes. And so that's very problematic. On the other hand, there's a political space that wasn't there before. How stable that is, you know, it's hard to say. We don't get too many reports from the country, and certainly not in the mainstream media. Many have integrated very well into our culture. You know, we're seeing a crop of little babies born here, you know, in the United States, which is always shocking to me, you know, whose parents came from El Salvador, or even people who were, let's see, that was all about, let's see, we're in 89, or even people who came here as children who are old enough now, you know, to have had children. And so there's a real integration into the larger Latino culture, of the United States, and tremendous contributions. And there's the generation of people who survived, got out and suffer from post-traumatic war syndrome. I had a dream about a friend of mine last night, and this is based on an actual phone call I had the other day. She's from El Salvador, fled there. Her parents, her whole family, very involved in liberation theology, in the work of the church. Literacy campaigns, that kind of thing. And but she had to flee finally. She got on a hit list. And she's now in the United States and making tremendous contributions. She's works as a health aide, a certified health aide, and she has also been a political organizer working with immigrants up in Santa Fe. But a nephew of hers was shot just recently. Again, part of this overall, as far as I can tell, part of this overall kind of crime wave. And it sent her into a spin, a real tailspin. It brings up a lot. And, those stories don't go away. They live in your body. Stories of the death and destruction in El Salvador, especially if you yourself experience torture or what have you. But it's amazing to see all that these people have survived and how they are now contributing to life in the United States. And I think enriching our sense of what it means to be a Latino.
Father Kiwis?
In Mother Tongue, you talk about the flight of the refugees and the death squads of El Salvador. But then also for the NCR, you write about the new death squads that are creeping up in the Arizona desert, vigilante groups who are shooting and actually killing immigrants that are coming to the United States. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, we don't want to pay $5 for a head of lettuce. And so when workers come up to pick the lettuce, so we don't have to pay $5 for a head of lettuce, people go ballistic. And so there have been, that's the root of it all. And so there have been a number of, for a long time, historically, there have been various kind of vigilante groups who, in different waves throughout history, become determined they're going to keep out those Mexicans who are either, stealing their jobs or, ruining the race, the white race of North America, depending on, their perspectives. And these vigilante groups have become very active along the Arizona-Mexico border and California, too. And they've been out there, just making so-called citizens arrests, shooting people. We don't know how many people have actually died at the hands of the vigilante groups because obviously they're not going to report the statistics to the FBI. And all this is part of a larger issue. The United States successfully sealed off in the early 90s the traditional urban crossing points into this country where people could cross, do their work, at the end of the week, cross back or what have you. And so this has forced people to now cross through the desert. And so at least one person a day dies at crossing over. And they cross in the brutal parts of the desert. It's either too hot or too cold, depending on the time of year. But these vigilante groups have become a worse problem than before, and they can, many of them in their own twisted minds, use the national security issue now. They're playing that card. Well, we're fighting the terrorists. So, it's all nuts. Millions of dollars were spent to chase me down, or to try to keep out immigrants. And bin Laden was taking flying lessons, all that time. It's a little bit nutty, but anyway. Thank you for your question.
In the novel, Maria, one of her struggles seems to be living in the present moment. She's always telling herself, I have to be in the present, I have to be here. And there are a couple different quotes that sort of caught my attention. One of them was, it is looking deeply into the here and now and thereby alter fate, and it is a frightful balancing act, attending to the moment in order to create the future. And then another point, you're talking about Soledad, and that by accepting things as they were, Soledad found energy to try and change the world, or at least her portion of it. And so I guess my question is that for you as a writer, a person who's very contemplative and someone who has a lot of knowledge of what's going on in the world, how are you able to, have a balance of living in the present and also, trying to change the future or trying to affect things around you that you can?
That is the best question I think I've had in years. You picked out two of my favorite quotes, and it speaks, I think, to my own kind of spiritual struggle. Once I did see a psychic during my trial, and I won't even go into that, it's a whole other story, and what she saw she couldn't have known. And I came away with a sense that the few people who are gifted that way don't see into the future. They see they're healers at a certain level. They see deeply into the human heart and the images. They pick up on certain images that you're obsessing on. And thereby they give you those images and they say, look, this is at the heart of the way you're seeing the world right now, and it's locking you in. And can you, in bringing this awareness to you, how can you now alter your future? In other words, the future is not locked. And so that's where that reference comes from. Soledad, I think, embodies in many ways the Hispanic Latino Catholicism that I grew up with. It often looked just really like fatalistic. What do you mean, you're going to pray the rosary, to end the war? I mean, shouldn't you be assassinating, I won't say who, but, shouldn't you be assassinating the many politicians here and throughout the world who, seem to enrich themselves with war? And I began to see a real strength in that depth of spirituality, that somehow praying the rosary was very much related to people's ability to find hope and strength to get out and to act. And to, show up to that potluck where the priest is going to talk about, what we can do at the protest tomorrow to try to stop the war. And that contemplation and action weren't apart, that they were very much, intertwined one with the other. And that what I often labeled fatalism came from a larger definition, really rooted in racism, that over time, people have been used to label Latinos and Catholics. Oh, those fatalistic people, all they do is, nothing, and they sit around and they wait and they pray and mañana, and not being able to see the deep core of spirituality that allows people to resist the most incredible circumstances, and to be a part of movements of solidarity and resistance. Thank you.
We want to leave plenty of time for people to enjoy the reception, and also to bring, if you have copies of the Mother Tongue or other books, and you can also purchase copies over here from the bookstore, to come up here and meet Demetria Martinez. And also, of course, you ask great questions, but she'll also be visiting Professor McCracken's class and Father Luis Kiwi's class tomorrow, so there'll be other opportunities. So please come up and meet Demetria Martinez, and let's all thank her very much for being here.